This is the Kea Research Podcast. Our podcast helps to bring you analyst insights from sages within the industry and from analyst relations leaders. Here's your host, Duncan Chapple, researcher and managing partner at Kea Research.
Thank you for joining this episode of Kea Company's podcast. Today we're speaking with Esther Boyer, a researcher at Kea Company, who's been speaking to industry analysts about the way that they are using business models. Esther, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and to talk about the research that you've been conducting.
Thank you for letting me the opportunity to do research.
Well, Esther, the people that you've been speaking to have been participants in the Analyst Attitude Survey. So I think most of the people who listen to the Kea Company podcast will know that for the last 16 years, my colleagues and I have been speaking to industry analysts and finding out about the research that they've been conducting. And I know that you've been a great person to involve in this because not only do you have the perspective of a business school graduate, that you're really in the habit of talking to people with different backgrounds and trying to better understand what's going on, but of course you also have a very strong sales background. So I think you also have a really interesting perspective on understanding the way that professionals are kind of gathering information and what they do in order to make business happen. Can you give me a little bit of perspective? Why is it that you've picked up on business models in these discussions with analysts? How did that come about as a topic of research in particular?
Well, after doing the survey and reviewing all the answers, we realized that analysts were in general more concerned about the importance of business model in their discussion with spokespeople than spokespeople themselves. Mm-hmm. Indeed, a business model have been reporting as around 25% more important than analysts than is it to spokespeople. Fewer than one analyst in 5 reports that spokespeople have a greater interest in business model. Okay,
so there was a kind of mismatch, I suppose, that the analysts seem to be more interested in business models, and the spokespeople that you were speaking to seem to be a little bit less interested. And so how did you kind of approach the research? How did you convince the analysts to take part in this study?
Well, we first tried to come up with some questions about why this gap would be about. And then we invited analysts to be part of a follow-up discussion of about 15 minutes most of the time to ask them what is their opinion about us, and also if there are any piece of advice to reduce it. And yeah, That's it really.
Okay, so you've been speaking to the analysts to try to understand why this gap exists and to try to get their feedback on what companies could be doing differently. Now, I've been eavesdropping on you having these conversations over the last few weeks. And I know that one artifact that you've been talking about or using in your discussions has been the research model from Foss and Saby. And I wonder, obviously, you've picked up on this diagram because it's something that kind of brings together a lot of the academic discussions, and it's a very comprehensive model. But do analysts have anything like a comprehensive model like this in their mind, or are some elements in this model maybe more relevant to analysts and other elements in this model maybe are rather in the background or are less thought about?
Well, when I first showed them the picture of the research model of business model innovation of Frost and Savvy, they've been a little bit overwhelmed because it's very academic, and in their daily life they don't speak of business model as business model. For them, it's more like a broad term, a generic term, and they have very different answer about business model than the academic paper that I've presented them with. What was very interesting is that they tend to join toward one definition that would be business model is like a framework about how company go to market and how they deliver commercial product. So that was the first start, and then we found that the antecedents were very important, can be internal or external as well, and the company as well, they were very interested in the moderators.
So here we're picking up a bit of jargon here. So when we talk about the antecedents, what does that mean? What are we talking about when we're talking about the antecedents? These are things that existed in the past, I guess.
Exactly. So you have two types of antecedents. The first one would be external, so it would be more the change in the competition, about more the general spectrum. It can be the stakeholder demands as well that can make the company change their business model. And then you have the second antecedent, which is internal antecedents. It could be the change in strategy of the company, and this plays on the business model.
Okay, so and I guess in a way that kind of lines up with a lot of discussions about strategy. That I guess when organisations are talking about strategy,
Exactly,
they're either taking an internal view and they're looking at their competencies and their capacities and their value, the value that they're generating, or they're taking more of an external view, looking at competitors and customer pressure and things like this. You also spoke about moderators. So what are moderators then?
Well, you have different kind of moderators. It would be all the little levers that plays on the company. So it can be regulation. I've been told that, for example, in the EU, regulation are more enforced than in the USA. So it plays a bigger role in companies that have their headquarters in the EU, for example. You can also have some moderators that are firm level. For example, it can be the values of the company, their culture, enterprise culture, so that plays a big role as well. And it can be also macro level, which is, for example, the open-mindedness of the company. And what I've found in the follow-up discussion is that startup tend to be more open-minded about their business model than bigger companies, because bigger company, I mean, they already have this fixed model, and because it's a bigger company, it's a bigger boat, it's a bigger ship, so it's difficult to navigate. In a smaller company, when you have 200 employees, it will be easier to make changes about the structure of the company and the business model than in big entities.
So I think when we talk about moderators, I think we might often think of things that make things more moderate.
Yeah, exactly. I would say more like the antecedents is like if you take the the metaphor of a tree, then the assistant is more like the roots and everything that's, the little seed that then becomes a big tree. And all the moderators can be the rain, can be the sun, and everything that, put pressure on the tree to grow. And then in the picture of Foss and Sebi, they say outcome as well. And the outcome would be the revenues in the revenue stream, and it will be also the cost reduction, and this will be the fruit of the tree.
So that analogy with the wind and the rain and the sunshine, I mean that's really nice, because so these moderators, they can be things that make corporate growth more moderate, but then they can also be catalysts. I must admit, I don't know what the opposite is of a catalyst, but let's say that they can accelerate or decelerate companies, and maybe even the same moderators might accelerate a company in one setting or decelerate in another, in the way that for lots of organizations their culture or their ability to respond to regulatory changes could be, there could be strengths sometimes and then weaknesses as others, as the environment around you changes. You also picked up on the point about differences between Europe and North America, and did you get the feeling that that's an important difference, or is that just something that is maybe similarly important to the people you've been speaking to as they are to business people generally?
Yeah, I perceive a big difference between the motivation of the US market, for example, and the EU market. One of the difference was about companies' aim, that are mainly about making profits and are less interested in how they make profits, but more like putting the goal of profit first hand, and then thinking about everything that goes after.
And that kind of makes sense if you think of the greater environmentally, the greater regulatory environment that we have more in Europe. And I think also there are cultural values at play there, aren't there? That if you're an entrepreneur in the United States, there's nothing wrong with losing other people's money. Businesses fail. But if you're, say, in Germany and you're an entrepreneur and you lose other people's monies, then you're a crook and and a very bad person. So I think that changes your attitude towards stakeholders, and there's simply more regulation to comply with.
Yeah, exactly. When you take, for example, EU regulation or tax regulation, also you get a sense of big difference between the EU market and the US market as well.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's kind of dig into the conversations that you've been having, and I know that the conversations that you've had have had to span a lot of different aspects. Can I just go back to the point you made at the opening, that when you were looking at the results from the Analyst Attitude Survey, you saw that there was a gap, that spokespeople weren't discussing business models as much as analysts do. And I suppose one thing on my mind is that borne out in the interviews that you had? Did the people you speak to agree with the people in the survey that there was this gap between how often analysts are thinking about business models and how often spokespeople are talking about business models?
Well, yes. When I asked them the question, almost all of them agreed on that the gap is real, and they tend to join on one answer, toward one answer.
They kind of converge?
Yes.
Okay.
They kind of converge toward one answer. And the answer is that AR spokespeople tend to be less specialized, so they tend to be more like PR. This were their words, and they they tend to dedicate to a certain business area and concentrate on getting the message out on the kind of marketing message rather than focusing on the business model of the company.
So that's interesting. I could imagine that in some ways analyst relations people could be simultaneously less and more specialized. I mean, they could be much more focused on communicating today's news, but they could be much less like specialists in the market. Often spokespeople are people who might be in product marketing or product management, and of course very often they're people with backgrounds in marketing and corporate communications rather than being technologists, I suppose.
Exactly. What analysts told me is that analysts tend to be focused in the general picture, and the AR spokespeople are either associated to one organization. So in this case, they can be all, maybe are not. They can be more interested in their company strategy. So they will talk about their own message, and also sometimes for smaller organization, the company asks for AR spokespeople that are part of an agency, and in this case it's more about getting out the marketing message rather than talking about specific company. And also one more thing is that the AR spokespeople usually talk to analysts during events where they have a script, where they have a polished kind of message about a special products, about a new service, new features, and they are less inclined to talk about anything else, because this message has been reviewed by the legal company, for example, the legal team. So they are not as free to talk about anything else than what they're here for.
That's interesting. So in these kind of planned interactions, which could be could be conferences or events, very often organizations are scheduling briefings, face-to-face briefings, telephone briefings. Very often these are going to be around one specific topic, I imagine.
Yeah.
And that might be the case whether it's being initiated by the analyst firm or by the vendor, that the vendor might want to speak to an analyst because they've got a new product or a new service or a new announcement. And then even the analyst firm might be interested in speaking about one particular aspect of what's going on. It was interesting to hear you talk about people from agencies. So obviously lots of companies now are using public relations agencies to help them with their communication. And I suppose on the one hand, these agencies might be have more of a market view because they're working across multiple clients. But then on the other hand, they're going to be less embedded inside the technologies, inside the technology discussion or the industry discussion of one specific firm. So did these analysts give you the impression that agency people were better intermediaries or worse intermediaries, or more or less the same?
Well, from what I felt is that analysts gave me the answer that they were less integrated in the company, such as, for example, I mean, it kind of makes sense when you think about AR spokespeople that have been working in the same company for a few years. They know the company, they know the market. They will be more able to speak about it than an AR agency that got, some documents about the company and who had, I don't know, maybe 1 week, 2 weeks to kind of make some research about the company and then go to that kind of events. And in a sense, that makes sense they can't know everything, and there are many companies, so they can't be a specialist, of every single company that are on the market.
That's true, and I can see there that one factor, just thinking of my own time working for public relations agencies 10, 15 years ago, that very often, no matter how good the public relations agent is, sometimes you are seeing the press release the day of the briefing or the day before the briefing. Sometimes you're seeing the slides half an hour before the meeting. It's very often the case that you know that there's going to be an announcement, so you book the appointment. Maybe it's Monday and you know there's going to be an announcement on Friday, so you book the appointment for Friday. But then maybe you don't see the things that are going to be discussed until the Friday morning, so you don't really have very much time to make sure that the analyst can have very rich or meaningful conversation.
Yeah, it must be very challenging for them as well. One other thing that I've realized is that when analyst people want to speak to companies, they can find themselves in hard position when they actually want to speak to somebody who is qualified and who has a deeper view in the company, who has a technical background to speak about that kind of technology or service, and also who is able to do so. So
what's hard about it? Is it that they can't get access to that person, or maybe they have to have too many interactions in order to get a full picture? What's the most difficult part of it?
Well, I think the first thing is that sometimes you simply can't find the right person to speak to, because that person doesn't exist. For example, for a smaller company, you will have somebody in marketing that will be also doing PR, and in this case, this person won't have, a deep insight of the challenges or of the subject that you're talking about. The second thing would be that sometimes company also have this polished script, and the employees, the AR spokespeople, are less free to talk about possible changes because it's not up to them, it's up to higher in the hierarchy. So analysts will try to find answers, but will be sometimes stopped because unless they actually speak to a member of board, they won't be able to speak to the right person and to get a proper answer.
So actually, I realised that this could be a very deep problem when it comes to business models, because it could be the situation not just that spokespeople are not very well prepared to talk about business models, but perhaps spokespeople are in the situation where if they don't have any prepared material to discuss about business models, they might not feel very comfortable improvising on that. And actually, companies that think they're helping spokespeople by giving them documents and guides, I mean, obviously the executives who speak are talented people, but maybe companies that are providing scripts and guides are actually hindering the ability of these executives to talk about business models. I'm sure they're super smart people. I'm sure they very well understand what the business models of their firms must be. But maybe the guides become a kind of scaffolding that confines what these spokespeople come from. So this gap, analysts are 25% more likely to want to talk about business models than analysts are. Maybe that gap could actually reflect a lot of there could be some fear and some concern. What else do you think might be going through the minds of people when they discover that this gap exists in interests?
Well, it could be inhibition, because if they're not allowed to speak about business model, then, period, it stops here. So unless it will become an official conversation between an analyst and an AR spokespeople. You will not have, during events, AR spokespeople taking the freedom to speak about something that they can't.
Mm-hmm. And so then that comes in to trust and the foundation of the relationship. I mean, if you're, imagine, you worked for a company in sales, meeting busy, business people, big cities, anxious customers, you need to supply things. If I ask you a question that you really should know the answer to, how do you make this, or how do customers experience it? And if you don't have an answer, of course, I don't think that you don't have an answer. I think you do have an answer, but you're ashamed to tell it to me. So it makes me feel that you're not trustworthy, that you're concealing something. And so maybe spokespeople not being prepared could actually have quite a significant impact on the trust that is the foundation of these relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also one of the answers I've received on that part is that sometimes the AR spokespeople are not media trained, and they don't really understand the role of analyst.
Mm-hmm.
Who ask a lot of questions, who trying to go deeper than the marketing
Mm-hmm.
surface. So in this way, I think kind of helping the AR spokespeople be more prepared
Mm-hmm.
to face the analyst as well.
Yeah.
It would be less than a big fight, a battlefield when you have from one side the analyst and from the other side the AR spokespeople saying like the AR spokespeople need to release one news about a product or service, and then they're kind of scared about all those questions that the analysts will throw like little swords, throwing to them. So it would be more about training them and also having the company trusting them a little bit more, saying, okay, you can talk about this subject and you can go this far, but also provide them with a little bit more information than just the script as well. One more thing as well is that in this training, the company need also to understand the value of having an external observer.
By which you mean the analysts?
Exactly. So then it's not only people who are, facing each other, but people trying to put together their knowledge in order to have the company grow or the market grow.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, I think it would reduce the gap as well.
So you think some spokespeople see analysts as adversaries, as sword throwers, rather than as people who are there to kind of illuminate the market and make it easier for those companies to grow and for their clients to make good choices?
Yeah, exactly. One of the analysts also told me that, for example, when he speaks to smaller companies like the startup tend to kind of fake the figures and the position when they are in, because they're trying to win deals. So they're trying to show their best side to the analyst, but the analyst's job is to try to understand why is it working, rather than just buying the regular marketing papers and and notes. So I think also more like a sincere talk would be easier.
Let's move on to this point about business models. So earlier on you were saying that academics have got some quite tight definitions of business models, but then it seemed to you that that the analysts that you spoke to maybe have got more open or emergent ideas of what a business model is?
So they have I mean, for them, the business model in itself is very vague. It's very broad. Sometimes they talk about impact kind of report. Sometimes they speak about research development. Sometimes they speak about technology. So they tend to focus on one part of the business model rather than the general term, because of course they adapt their speech to their client as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, are there some people? So it sounds like these analysts have got different areas of focus within the business model. But then, are there some people who are like real business model advocates? You know, are there some people who say, yes, the business model, that's very important to us and a really, really important part of the way that we look at things? And are there others who say, well, actually, we're a bit suspicious about this idea of there being business models? Or was everybody more or less in the middle, having a somewhat improvised attitude towards business models?
I would say the last one. They tend to have an improvised attitude. They tend to adapt their speech to their clients, and also they tend to think that business model is not the end, is not the goal you're reaching, but it's more a way. It's more like a tool to help you selling your product or your service.
Mm-hmm. So when analysts are asking about the business model, what do they expect the vendor to talk about? What is the business? What are the elements? What are some of the elements? What are some of the questions that analysts are asking? And what are the things that they expect to hear when they ask people, tell me about your business model?
Well, they basically ask about, so how they go to market, mainly about, some of them will talk about research and development. They will ask, so how is this company goes now? Do you expenditures, but also their plan of expansion. They also ask their strategy regarding one category or one product. So they have very various questions. They tend to really, really adapt to the client they have in front of them. And also, I've heard very different answers. So yeah, it's kind of difficult to put all the answers I have got into one definition, because indeed there is not. Business model is different for everybody, and it means also different things. And sometimes the analysts are less interested as well in business model. They let business model matters to other people in their company, for example, more strategy people. And sometimes they are really, into business model and more inclined to speak about this with their client.
But it sounds as if we were to think back to the model from Forst and Saby that you were talking about, it sounds as if no analysts are using that model, but it does sound like everything fits into that model. I mean, people are asking about how do you go to market. Where are you profitable? I think research and development is very important because it shows which changes in the market people are anticipating or which changes people have anticipated. And then also asking about the competition, asking about market categories. I think most of these things seem to fit inside the categories.
Yeah, but they don't recognize business model as business model. They tend to speak about their features, but they tend to they don't use this term. So that's why, in first place, when they ask them what business model means to you, they took some time to think actually about business model and what could it mean, a general definition when there's not.
So does that mean that we're in the interesting situation where analysts said, we think about business models more than the vendors do, even though they themselves didn't really have a very clear definition of what a business model is? Maybe you don't need to know what it is. It's like a perfect holiday. Anybody can talk about a perfect holiday, but you might not be able to really write it down and define it. Maybe it's the kind of thing that you only know when you recognize it, or maybe you only know after you have experienced it. But did there seem to be any common elements at all? I mean, maybe things about customer value or about market segments. Were there any sort of commonalities, or were some factors more likely to be spoken about than others? Or was it just a big bag of jumbled up attributes?
Well, I've heard a lot about how companies create and capture value with all the levers, that the mechanism that company uses to create and to capture this value. Also, one of the things some of the analysts asked me was, in which situation are you asking me about business model? Is it when I talk about my own company, the company I'm working in? Is it the business model of my clients? Because apparently it seems that there's a difference, and they tend to adapt their speech again.
So there's a triad, I suppose, that these analysts might be thinking about the business model of the vendors that they are interviewing, the business model of the enterprises and the public sector organizations which they and the analysts are both trying to serve. And then they might also be thinking about their own business models. And these are three such different sorts of organizations that, again, maybe that's another reason why there might be a plurality of ideas about what the business model means, and it could even be quite contextualized. As you say, an analyst might say, well, if we're talking about business models, are we talking about like my client's business model, or are we talking about the vendor business model? Because I'm going to be asking very different questions and using very different analytical frameworks to appraise, whether the business model is good for the vendor or whether it's going to be a business model that's going to work effectively for the client. And maybe that's where value appropriation comes in. Because if you've got a vendor that's very, very good at appropriating the value that it's creating for a client, then maybe that leaves the client as a loser. Whereas if you've got a vendor that maybe doesn't have a very good business model because it's not very good at capturing all of the value that it creates, well, maybe that's fantastic news for the client, because it means that the client is coming away with the benefits that are being generated by these new technologies.
Exactly.
What else came out in your discussions? We've spoken about so much, and it definitely seems like this kind of model from Force and Saby, even though it's not recognised or used by analysts, it does seem like a good tool to prepare spokespeople with. That if spokespeople come in to meet analysts and they're aware of these different elements and they've got good answers for these different elements, then it sounds like they would be better prepared and they would look more candid and more trustworthy, and they would have better discussions with analysts. But are there other elements that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, indeed. One of the challenges that the companies have been facing as well is that it is difficult to see flows in the business model of a company. I mean, it's difficult for a company to see its own flows in its own business model in a fast-growing market.
Mm-hmm. And I could imagine that could be difficult because analysts look for flaws.
Yeah.
And they're very curious people, and they might find a lot of they might get a lot of praise from their colleagues when they find a flaw in the model of a vendor. But of course, not only does the vendor not want to hear that, but again, because of the poor media training, vendors might not be very well able to make sure that their spokespeople can respond appropriately when an analyst thinks they found a flaw.
Yes, it can be that, but it also can be that the company itself, the vendors, think that their business model is doing fine. And because it's doing fine, they're making profits, why would they change it? And why would they welcome negative opinion about their successful business model? It is very hard to change if it's working. And usually vendors will come back and welcome all the analyst comments when their company is not doing so well, obviously. But also, one of the challenges that face analysts is that because it's a fast-growing market and analysts are focusing also on the next trend, the actual company will be sometimes reluctant to put their money on something that is not happening yet. So especially if it's maybe a smaller company that doesn't have a lot of revenue to put in R&D, for example, and they will be less inclined to listen to analysts saying, oh, this is the right way to go. So, and just announce that this is what's working for them now, and they will just follow until it kind of fades, and then they will change. So in this way, it's hard for spokespeople to also be, open-minded about this, because they're just following the guideline of a company that doesn't want to change, and analysts find it hard to get their word out because they feel that they won't be listened to.
And so it sounds like a fantastic opportunity to vendors to have these sorts of conversations about business models, because of course analysts are looking at very similar firms all the time, and they may have spotted a future flaw that the vendor may not be aware of. It's like a dietitian speaking to a 30-year-old man, telling him that he has to stop eating like a 20-year-old man, otherwise he's going to be as big as I am now by the time he's my age. And you when things are going well, you don't want to hear that.
Exactly.
But actually, it's only an external advisor who can give you that insight. So it's a very unintended benefit, perhaps, of vendors, that if they prepare for this kind of conversation with analysts, the feedback they get back from analysts could really be critical in helping their companies to adapt and to perform better in the future.
Yeah. Also, maybe the type of interaction between analysts and spokespeople could be also change in the way that it is less informal, and then AR spokespeople get back the information to the company in an informal way, rather than having events and one analyst pointing out the flows of company, saying, oh, this is not working, or you need to change now or tomorrow, because otherwise you will be facing difficulty in the future, and kind of borrow some other channels to get back the information and help the companies.
Okay, well, look, that seems like a very kind of concrete direction, and a very good way to roll up our conversation today. Esther, do you have a final point for our listeners before we close the podcast?
Yeah, Well, it was really interesting to speak with the analyst. I want once more to thank them for their time.
Mm-hmm.
It was very generous. And also, I hope that our spokespeople will find it less hard in the future to have conversation with the analyst.
Okay.
And hopefully business model will be discussed a little bit more broadly, and it will help companies.
Esther Boyer, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time, Duncan.
Thank you for joining us on the Kea Research podcast. Visit www.kearesearch.com for more information on everything we talked about today, as well as free indispensable information on influencer relations and analyst value. Sign up for our newsletter and receive a free copy of our book, Influencer Relations: Insights on Analyst Value.